Hello everyone, Professor Helmling here. Today I want to talk to you about Chapter 5 from Alice LaPlante's The Making of a Story, which she titles Why You Need to Show and Tell. Now, Alice and I do not always see eye to eye, and some of what she says in this chapter rankles me a bit. The central premise of the chapter is that the tried and true creative writing teacher advice of show don't tell is, and I quote her here, wrong. Yes, she goes on to admit that wrong is too strong of a word, but I'd say it's not just too strong, it's not accurate. Now, full confession here. When I teach creative writing to my high school students, there's a poster on my wall with my 4 commandments of creative writing. You can probably guess what number 1 is. So I'm definitely one of those creative writing teachers she's talking about who has said show don't tell countless times as writing advice. So you might think I'm reacting to her criticism of that advice because she's slaughtering one of my favorite sacred cows. But hopefully you'll bear with me while I break down what I think are the limitations in the way she's talking about show don't tell here, and why I will admit that the conversation she starts with Chapter 5 is very, very worth having. So, is show don't tell simplistic advice? Sure. Now, LaPlante's premise, though, seems to assume that when we say show don't tell, what we mean is always show, never tell, which I don't think there's anyone, at least not anyone competent, her word, who's ever said those words and meant them that way. But I also kind of take issue with the way that she defines showing and telling. She tells us on page 205 that showing is dramatizing and that telling is narration. I'm not sure I really agree with that generalization. For me, showing is when we expand a moment or idea in the text. We go beyond the simple denotation of the words on the page and evoke something or try to evoke something for our readers through imagery or dialogue or figurative language. Basically, LaPlante and I don't fully agree on the definitions here. Take one of her comments on page 206. She says that one example of telling is when a writer, quote, reveals specific thoughts or emotions of the characters involved. Now, I would say to that, well, that depends on how we reveal those thoughts. And she provides a great example of why she is wrong later in the chapter. On page 209, she quotes the opening of Lolita. Now, folks, if you've never read or heard of Lolita, it is a disturbing book. The narrator, who we know only by his pseudonym Humbert Humbert, is a pedophile who becomes obsessed with a young girl named Lolita. And by the way, if you ever hear someone use the name Lolita to describe an overly sexual young girl, please take a moment to remind that person that in the novel, Lolita is a victim. Anyway, LaPlante quotes the opening of Lolita on page 209, and she characterized it as telling. Now, later on page 217, she renders a completely different told version of that opening, which sounds completely flat and terrible, but it's completely different and has a completely different effect. Now, why is that? Well, I would say the first version is not telling at all. That second version on page 217 isn't Humbert at all. Humbert is a highly articulate, highly intelligent character. That's what's most disturbing about the novel, is that this narrator, who is a monster, is also so compelling as a narrator. It's what makes the book such a monumental, genius text. And the real opening that LaPlante shares with us on page 209 isn't just telling us. It's showing us Humbert's mind, showing us how it works. Just like when she says on page 221 that voice stories like Scratch Music by C.D. Wright are pure narration because they just sound like a character talking without interruption, I would counter, that's monologue. Monologue is dramatizing. It is showing. She does this throughout the chapter. My margin notes have a lot of implied or explicit exclamation points because it drives me crazy. Look at page 219. She quotes The Shipping News by Annie Proulx as an example of a telling novel because it relies so heavily on narration. One of the lines that she quotes is, "There was a hole in the station wagon's floor, and through it spurted occasional geysers of dirty rainwater." I would argue spurted occasional geysers is a showing move. Now, one of the chapters where LaPlante and I agree most is her chapter on point of view, where she argues, and I agree, that third-person narrators are true narrators. And this quote is an example of that. that interspersed with narration, there are showing moves. LaPlante's contention is that this is just well-written narration. And she argues on page 216 that creative writing teachers use show don't tell as their mantra because good telling is difficult to do. My margin notes, by the way, right there are 3 no's all in a row. Anyway, I think what bothers LaPlante so much is that students might internalize show don't tell as a mantra and just constantly spout that back at their peers in workshop without thinking carefully, as I like to think I do, I hope so, about when to offer show don't tell as advice. For example, when I'm reading a student piece, I look for moments that I think need more life. Need to, as LaPlante says, stop the clock of the story and let the reader really soak it in. Not necessarily always arguing for a full scene when I say show don't tell. But those moments are where I'll advise students to do some more showing. Sometimes that can just be a line. LaPlante is worried, I think, that students will come away thinking the answer is always to show. And I do 100% agree with her comment on page 217 that there's a big difference between a creative piece that is truly crying out for more scenes and a piece in which the narration is technically weak. What it all comes down to is that telling a story requires judgment. We've got to make choices. We've all listened, sometimes painfully, as a small child has told us a story. They have no sense of which events are important, which events can be ignored, which can be glossed over, which need to be really presented with detail, really need to be brought to life, need to be shown, not just told. And that's why I think LaPlante's premise is a little off-kilter in this chapter, even if her advice is good. Show don't tell isn't about always showing or even mostly showing. It's about learning when to show. When your audience needs to be transported into a moment, needs to be given something vivid and rich, and when they don't. We show when it will help move the story or theme forward. So remember I mentioned my 4 commandments for creative writing that I have on my high school classroom wall. The 4th one is the specific lingers in the reader's hearts and minds. The general, not so much. It's a corollary to show don't tell, and I think it provides elaboration that LaPlante would appreciate. It's the specific and tangible that makes our writing real for the reader. The most important idea in the chapter and the central advice that she builds up to, and with which I do fully agree, is on page 224. She says, determining the particular mix of showing and telling that is right for you is a major part of finding your voice as a writer. Each of us has to find the right balance for the stories we want to tell or poems we want to create. As with so much in life, that's the secret, finding the balance. And that's why we practice. That's why we read. That's why we scribble angry notes to LaPlante in the margins. So I hope that's helpful in breaking down and thinking about the chapter a little bit more. And I hope you enjoyed it, even if you were, like me, a little irritated with some of what she said, or maybe you were more in tune with her. But that's about it for this one, and I will see you all later in class.